This video is going to deal with the function of the cell membrane. Now, the function of the cell membrane is to allow certain materials to come into the cell and allow certain materials to go out of the cell and prevent other things. For example, it is important for nutrients to get into the cell, but not harmful substances. And it's important for wastes to get out of the cell, but not things that the cell needs to retain. So the cell membrane needs to be selectively permeable, meaning it's able to let certain things in and out of the cell and be very selective about that. A couple of the processes that we are going to look at first are diffusion and osmosis. And these are types of passive transport. Passive transport means no energy necessary. So diffusion and osmosis is how molecules will move into and around the cells. When we look at this picture here, we can see that this is a good example of diffusion. Diffusion, by definition, is molecules moving from a high concentration to a low concentration with no energy being expended to make this happen. So if we look in this area here, we can see a lot of molecules in this space outside of the cell, called the extracellular space, outside the cell, but very few molecules inside the cell. Now, because there are so many molecules outside the cell, they tend to want to flow from a high concentration to a low concentration. So they are going to move from this area into this area. And one of the reasons that they do that is because molecules are constantly in motion and they're bumping into each other. And when they bump into each other in a high concentration, there are a lot more collisions. And those collisions force them into areas where there's less of those molecules. And so they move from a high concentration to low concentration. As we can see through these pictures here, we can see this is the first step, this is the second step, and this is the third step, until we reach what we know as equilibrium, where we have an equal number on both sides. Now, this does not mean that the molecules stop moving. It just means that as one molecule moves in one direction, you will generally get a molecule moving in the opposite direction. And that is equilibrium. So if we were to put a drop of dye into water on one side, we would have our high concentration right here. But over a period of time, that dye would move from the area of high concentration to low concentration until we reach what's known as equilibrium. That is diffusion. And so if we look at a very easy example of this, here's our dye in a glass of water. And so we can see that as the dye enters the water, right here, it's in a high concentration. But over a period of time, it's moving from the high concentration into low concentrated areas. And that would be in the example of diffusion. And if we gave this a decent amount of time, it would fill the entire container with this red coloring. It's because it's continuing to move from a high concentration to low concentration. So there is a definition of diffusion, which we need to know. It is the movement of molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And if you would like to add that no energy is required, no extra energy, because the molecules already contain the energy necessary in order to bump into each other, that would also be something you could add. That would be an example of passive transport. Passive transport means no energy is needed. Now, when we talk about osmosis, osmosis is a type of diffusion. The diffusion, this time though, has specifically to do with water. And it is the water diffusing through a semi-permeable membrane. Waters are still moving from a high concentration to low concentration because it is still diffusion. So what we have here is straight down the middle, we have our semi-permeable membrane. In this case, we're calling it a differentially permeable membrane, but it's the same thing, meaning some things can pass through and some things cannot. On this side, we have our water molecules, and those are the little circles. And then on this side, we have sucrose ovals, these green things. They're very big. You can see that these are unable to pass through this small space here. So it is allowing, this membrane is allowing water to pass through, but not sucrose. The water, being in a high concentration on this side, is moving in this direction toward a lower concentrated side of the water molecules. Now, if the membrane was permeable to sucrose, the sucrose wants to go over to this side. But because this membrane openings, the pores in the membrane are too small, it is unable to do that. So the sucrose has to stay on this side. And we are only allowing the water to move from the high concentration of water to a lower concentration of water. And that is osmosis, which is the diffusion of water. The rate at which molecules move into the cell is equal to the rate of molecules moving outside the cell if you are at an equilibrium. So when we say equilibrium, we're talking about a dynamic equilibrium. Dynamic means things are still moving. It's not like they get to one side and they just stop. They continue to move, but it's a equal rate of molecules moving from one side to the other if it's at equilibrium. So if one moves in, one moves out, that rate is going to be equal if it has reached equilibrium. Keep in mind the molecules do not stop moving. Once again, the definition of semi-permeable, we've used this term. It is allowing certain substances to pass through, but not others. It acts kind of like a screen. So if you have a screen in a window, it allows air to pass through, but it does not allow bugs or other kind of larger particles to move through. And we can see in this picture here that we have a semi-permeable membrane, and we can see those little water molecules are able to pass through it. So here's our semi-permeable membrane. You can see right here, you get a couple of water molecules passing through. There's one going this way, and there's this one going this way. But these larger molecules, they must be too big for these pores in this semi-permeable membrane. And so they're stuck on the left side, whereas the water is able to move from a high concentration to low concentration through osmosis directly through that membrane because the holes are small enough to prevent the big molecules, but large enough to allow the water molecules to go through. In this picture, the question is, what is allowed to move through? And so we have our membrane right down the middle, just like in the last, but we have these openings right here. We kind of have a cross section. So there's the opening there, but then these yellow spaces right here are also the openings. And the question is, what color molecules can go through? Well, can the yellow molecules go through? Does this molecule here look smaller than that hole? If so, then it can go through. Does this green one look smaller than the hole? Then it can go through. How about that purple one? How about this dark one down here, this dark blue? That might be a question. I think so far we have the yellow, the green, the purple. The dark blue is questionable. What about these large red blood cells? No, I don't think that they'd be able to go through because they're much larger than the opening. So this membrane is permeable to all molecules in this picture except the red blood cells and possibly the dark large molecules as well. An interesting experiment is done with diffusion through a membrane using iodine and starch. Now, the first thing about iodine is that iodine, when mixed with starch, remember starch we talked about in the past was a polysaccharide, and it's found in plants. It's a energy storage carbohydrate in plants. It's found in potatoes, found in bread. But if you mix iodine with starch, you get a purple color. So let's just see what we have happening here. In this video, we have a bag. I'm just going to stop it. We have a bag with starch on the inside, and we have iodine and water on the outside of the bag. Now, the question is, does the starch come out of this bag? And when I say bag, it's really a semi-permeable membrane that has been tied into a bag. So there's tiny openings inside the walls of this bag so things can move in and out. The question is, what is moving in and out? Is it the starch going to come out, or is the iodine going to go in, or is it going to be a little of both? Well, if iodine turns the starch purple and iodine goes into the bag, then what color would the bag become? If the starch is able to come out of the bag, then what color would the surroundings become? And if iodine can go in and starch can come out, then what color would the inside and outside of the bag be? So let's continue this and see what happens. We can see that the bag, inside of the bag, is becoming dark. It's turning purple. But the outside of the bag is not turning purple. And so this leads us to believe that after a period of time, iodine has gone into the bag, but starch has not come out of the bag because the bag itself is now purple. So iodine plus the starch made it purple. But because the starch didn't get out, the outside remains the same color as it was initially. So we have a purple bag, iodine got in. Therefore, this membrane is permeable to iodine, but not permeable to starch. Based on that video, we should be able to write a paragraph, or at least talk out a paragraph using these terms here: diffusion, high concentration, low concentration, equilibrium, semi-permeable, or permeable. So, where was the high concentration of iodine? The high concentration of iodine was outside the bag. The high concentration of starch was inside the bag. Where was the low concentration of starch? Well, there was none outside the bag, so that's the lowest concentration. And initially, there was a very low concentration of iodine in the bag. None. But over a period of time, the iodine diffused into the bag until it reached an equilibrium because it was semi-permeable to iodine. The membrane in the bag was semi-permeable to iodine, but it was impermeable to starch. So these are the terms that we should be able to use when communicating things like diffusion and osmosis and how things move through membranes. So my answer for that experiment was there was a high concentration of iodine out of the bag and a low concentration of iodine inside the bag. Since the membrane was permeable to iodine, iodine diffused from outside the bag to inside the bag where it changed the color of starch. Once the iodine was equally distributed, it was at equilibrium. So these are the things that we should be thinking about. Okay, this ends the video on basic movement of molecules in terms of diffusion, osmosis, the term semi-permeable, and an overall term of passive transport because no energy was needed in any of these situations.